Hello, everybody. My name is Bruce Bishop, and I'm an author and writer of many years. And I am wanting today to give you a few tips about writing historical fiction and specifically 20th century fiction. My four books started with Unconventional Daughters in 2020. Uncommon Sons followed the next year. Undeniable Relations the year after that, and most recently, Grow Up, Rory Rafferty was published on October 31st, 2024. The range here of dates are 1883 with Unconventional Daughters. That went on to 1935. Uncommon Sons was 1935-36. Undeniable Relations, 1956 to 58. And Grow Up, Rory Rafferty took place in 1970, or takes place rather, in 1979 in Toronto, Canada. In fact, all of my novels are taking place in Nova Scotia or Canada. Now, some tips to inspire you to bring your period alive. You can use visual stimulation, photographs, newspaper, magazine advertisements, films. Auditory stimulation would be music and radio broadcasts, old sound effects. Scents and smells. Is there a product that was introduced during your chosen time period? That's still sold today and people can identify with. Tastes. Was there a food product that was introduced in the time period you've chosen to write about that is still for sale today? As I mentioned, most of my books, or all of my books rather, take place in Nova Scotia or Toronto, as in the last book. And these are some pictures from Nova Scotia or Halifax, the capital city, in the 1930s. When you look at old pictures, you begin to realize what the area looked like at the time and how much it might have changed since then. This is a good example. This is Pier 21, Pier 20 in Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia, where cruise liners would bring people over from Europe and take people to Europe. It is also the area which we call Canada's Ellis Island, Pier 21. That's where most of the immigrants who came to Canada before and following World War II were processed through, and where many of our troops during World War II left from. The building in the middle of the picture is the Nova Scotian Hotel, and that was built in 1929. This is just another picture of the area around uh, Pier 21 and the Nova Scotian Hotel, which is still in existence today. Think of the place that you're talking about or writing about, rather, and what it might have looked like in the time period you've chosen. This is Halifax waterfront in the 1920s, I believe. At the top, those who might know the city, it is a picture of Citadel Hill. So once again, to find out the places to receive some visual stimulation of the time period, YouTube has many, many old videos and archival videos of places and events that have happened in history. Google is so valuable for many, many things to research. Excuse me. Local archives, whether they be municipal, provincial, or state archives. You can go to sometimes private archives. For example, a corporation that's been around for more than 100 years would probably have its own archives as well, where you can access old photographs and documents. Internet archives, you can see the visual on the right side of the screen there. It's amazing. You can listen to old radio recordings, music recordings, watch film clips, TV and radio commercials. There's an awful lot there. So fun to to look around in. And of course, your local museums where they would have artwork on display or artifacts, antiques, whatever that might help you in spurring some creativity, some inspiration. I like, in particular, old postcards, and this is one of the Lord Nelson Hotel in Halifax. It it was also built around the time of the Depression, but it's important to see how the neighborhood has changed and looks very, very different today. Once again, going back on the theme of postcards, I used a postcard of an old Canadian Pacific Railway hotel. The building is still there, but this was what the hotel looked like in the 1930s on the left of the screen. So the uh, postcard that I found at the Nova Scotia Archives, I was able to use that by paying a small fee to the archives, and it was modified by a professional book cover designer and turned into the cover of my second book, Uncommon Sons. You can see two figures walking towards the hotel. That was added by the book cover designer from another stock photograph. Buildings or businesses that are no longer in existence, there will be pictures of them in various archives. I used this store called Mills Brothers, which was a very, at the time, very exclusive ladies' wear store in Halifax. Um, I used that store as a meeting place for two of the characters and dialogue between two of the characters in Uncommon Sons. Another postcard showing the exit sort of to Point Pleasant Park, looking southbound on Yonge Avenue. If you know Halifax, there are now very, very beautiful private homes on either side of the street, but this is what the Point Pleasant Park looked like when it was first opened, and another picture of the park. Communities that are no longer in existence, this one in particular of Africville. Africville was in the north end of the city that was bulldozed by the city in the 1960s, very tragically so. And it is now a park. Africville was important for me to do research on because two characters in Uncommon Sons, I had them living in Africville, which was primarily an African Canadian community in the north end of the city back in the day. You also should be looking at world events that may have happened in your town, city, province, or state at the time that will add flavor to your story and will perhaps remind people that what happened at one time is not that different than what may be happening today. In this example with Adrian Arcand, a Nazi sympathizer, he there was a rise of fascism in Canada in the mid 1930s, and he was one of the instigators of that. There was a terrible mine disaster in Nova Scotia at the time that the news of this cave-in at the gold mine went around the world. Once again, just showing how popular this sympathizer, this politician was at the time, who is virtually not known about in English Canada for the most part. Movie stars at the time, you may find that two movie stars of the time period you're writing about could have come from your state, your city, or your province. In my case, it was Ruby Keeler from Nova Scotia, as well as David Manners, who were both of whom were very, very popular during the 1930s. Pop culture at the time is important also for you to learn about the game of Monopoly was introduced in the 1930s. Gone with the Wind was one of the top selling novels of 1936, and Jello was right there with its new flavor of lime. They even produced a Coca-Cola flavored Jello that year, but its popularity lasted only about 8 months. Find pictures that will evoke emotions in you. This picture of Halifax with the streetcar, the church steeples, the foreboding cloudy sky, all can help you develop your storyline and your characters when you see pictures taken at the same time where they were uh, around. My first three books were an interlinked trilogy, as I talked about before. Um, and these are pictures from the that I used for writing the first book, Unconventional Daughters, a very popular mode of transportation at the time in the 1920s were steamships that came up from Boston and New York to Nova Scotia. There were even trains that would pick up passengers right from the wharf and take them to places beyond Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, Halifax, St. John, and places like that. I used, I was lucky to have, I should say, by using some old letters that were given to me many years ago, written by a woman who was writing her mother when this young woman was on her honeymoon in Europe in 1927. And although they were pretty standard letters, nothing terribly remarkable, they were written by a woman who had basically married her mother's second husband. So a very unconventional marriage, a very unusual family. And that was the inspiration I received for Unconventional Daughters. This is what used to be another railway hotel in Yarmouth called Lakeside Inn. It is now a seniors home, but I used the building and the research I did on the building as a hotel in the 1920s to include several scenes from there. Similarly, with the original Grand Hotel in Yarmouth, built in the 1890s to house the influx of American tourists in the summer months. This place was torn down in the 1960s and another hotel built to replace it. Some interior shots of the Grand Hotel, the original, which again helped me in writing and describing what the hotel might have looked like at the time. Another smaller building in Yarmouth is called Murray Manor, but it's one of the very first residential homes built in Yarmouth. And again, I used a couple of scenes set in this house during the writing of Unconventional Daughters. I had a wedding take place in this building, which is called the Churchill Mansion. It was built as a summer home for a sea captain, and it is still in existence today, although again, a private home. But this is what it looked like in the 1920s, and it was nice to be able to describe it in my book. The original Yarmouth Lighthouse looked like this. That was torn down in the 1960s and replaced with a different lighthouse. So always make sure that you know if buildings are still in existence or have been torn down. Readers will pick you up on things like this if you don't get the correct timelines. This is a picture showing the collection of contraband alcohol during Prohibition in Yarmouth in the 1920s. A vaudeville group was incredibly popular in World War I and really right up until 1932. They were called the Dumbbells. So I used them as inspiration for a fictitious group of entertainers, and I call them the Dum Dums. And the two quote unquote women here are in fact female impersonators. A building that is no longer there in Yarmouth is a bookseller by the name of Edgar J. Vickery rather, and again just gave me a good idea of how to set a scene in this store, because even from this picture, I'm learning about what is inside the store, and I can describe it as I have my characters walking into it and talking to the owner. This was the original Yarmouth Academy, a high school that was destroyed by fire in 1949, but I could have my protagonist in the 1920s, early 1920s, be a student here at the school and be able to describe what the school looked like. This is the building where the real family lived that gave me the inspiration for Unconventional Daughters. It is now a service club. The archives in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia gave me a lot of information about, again, the time period and some of the family members, the real family members. And indeed, I was glad to find this picture because when a family had a bit of wealth, they were able to either hire muralists or buy artwork that was popular at the time to decorate their home, including polar bear rugs were quite the thing in the 1920s. And this family had at least one of them. One of the original, or one of the family members of that family that inspired Unconventional Daughters, standing in front of her guest house and her home outside Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. My third example here is Undeniable Relations, which was set in 1950, well, between 55 and 58, really. And that's the original Yarmouth Lighthouse that you saw a picture of earlier. And I use that as a cover for this book. It's good for you to let people know always exactly where your story takes place. I refer a lot to Yarmouth and Nova Scotia and Eastern Canada and the Maritime provinces because that's the part of the world that I'm most familiar with and where I've lived for many years. This slide shows the route of the rum runners during Prohibition who left Yarmouth and sold their contraband to gangsters basically in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey on the eastern seaboard. And again, a lot of that contraband liquor was received from Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, two little islands off the coast of Newfoundland. And at the time, Newfoundland was still a British colony. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is still a French colony. And once again, make sure that while you're writing in a historical context, you know the history of the region because, again, a reader would pick you up on any inconsistencies. Newfoundland and Labrador, that area here, Newfoundland and Labrador didn't become a Canadian province until 1949. So during Prohibition, it was the 1920s, and Newfoundland and Labrador were still British colonies. In 1956, we had a car ferry leave Yarmouth for Bar Harbor, Maine, which took many Nova Scotian tourists to New England and brought many American visitors back. And that area and that time period is where I based the second, or pardon me, the third book, Undeniable Relations. A couple of pictures here show what it was like on the Bluenose arriving into Yarmouth. And those were the days when people just didn't come over for, a few days. They would spend at least a couple of weeks. This was the time when people piled all the kids in the big station wagon and went on extended vacations in the summertime. So the mid 50s was quite a time for tourism, and I wanted to use that time for the in the context of undeniable relations. These slides just certainly show the popular parades at the time. A subplot in Undeniable Relations is regarding Hungarian refugees landing in Nova Scotia. And therefore, I had to start to look up pictures. It was a very short uprising in October, November of 1956, but it was very important to Hungarians to rebel against the Soviet Union, and many of them ended up emigrating to Canada, and they would have come through Pier 21 in Halifax. Again, we're seeing a picture here of the Grand Hotel, the original hotel in Yarmouth, where many of the long-term visitors stayed. A scene or a picture of probably the most popular department store in Nova Scotia during the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 70s. Pictures like this can help you even look at cars of the period, but find out what prices of things would have been at the time. This was opening day of a grocery store called Sobeys in Yarmouth in the mid 1950s. So quite a big event. If you're writing about a character who is of a particular faith, in this case, I had a character who was French Acadian, who had sort of lost her religion, but wanted to confess what she called her sins to a local priest. So a confessional booth at the time in a church in the 1950s in Canada might have looked like this, where the uh, penitent is in goes in this door on the right hand side or the left hand side. The priest is in the middle, and he opens up a screen to talk to the person wanting to confess his or her sins. You will also probably find pictures or learn about some notorious gangsters at the time, whether it be from Prohibition, like this fellow, or later on. This is one method of transporting alcohol from one boat to another during Prohibition at the time. And again, on the same topic of alcohol, things are very, very different. Where in Nova Scotia in the 1950s and into the 1960s, you had to have a permit to buy alcohol. You would go into a building that almost looked like a bank, talk to a clerk, and the clerk would go behind uh, with your permit in hand and get the alcohol that you requested. Was also interested to find out at the time of a civil rights leader in Nova Scotia who established a newspaper in 1946. Her story and some of her family members also helped me in developing a subplot in Undeniable Relations about race relations in Nova Scotia in the 1950s. A big, very popular musical variety show from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was called Don Messer's Jubilee. So if you include, again, pop culture items like this in your storyline, even though you might not have been around yourself to see that event, your parents or your grandparents or relatives might remember them. If you look at pictures from the time period you're writing about, this picture from downtown Halifax in 1958, I noticed that it shows a marquee for the Garrick Theatre. Well, the Garrick Theatre is now Neptune Theatre, a professional theatre company in the province. This dining room picture from the Nova Scotian Hotel in 1953 really helps when you're writing a scene set in a formal hotel dining room. And I used this as inspiration twice in two books for that purpose. If you're looking at other things regarding the pop culture of the day, look for the most popular musical stars at the time: Chubby Checker, Pat Boone, Doris Day, on and on. And you can also find headlines from famous newspapers of the time that again help you. So that's about it for this presentation. You can get any of my novels on Amazon in paperback and ebook form, on Kobo in ebook form, and they are sold in certain Nova Scotian retailers, both in Halifax and Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Thanks so much for joining me today. And if you have any questions, please go to my website and send me a note through brucebishopauthor.com. Thank you.